Hello everyone, it's the Motorcycle Muse here. I'm going to do a video to explain how the starter clutch works in the engine of your motorcycle. Now the starter clutch on this particular engine is actually hidden behind the rotor, which is this cylindrical looking bowl on the end of the crankshaft. But on some engines, the starter clutch can be a standalone unit on a separate shaft. So the starter clutch works in tandem with the starter motor, which is this unit here, to get the engine running. Now I've removed all the covers from this particular engine so that you can easily see inside, but I've left all the gears in place so it's a little bit easier to explain what's going on. So let's go back to starting the motorcycle. So if you want to start your motorcycle, you turn on your ignition and you hit the starter button with your right thumb. Now, which is at the handlebar. So when you hit that, press in that starter button, it completes the circuit, which allows power to flow to the starter motor. And when the starter motor has power flowing to it, it causes this output shaft from the starter motor to rotate. Okay, so it has a number of splines on it, which connect up with these intermediate reduction gears. And these intermediate reduction gears are actually connected to this main gear here, this very large gear, which is called the starter clutch driven gear. So output shaft rotates, acts on these gears here, so I can remove them just so you can see. So the starter motor acts on this gear, which causes this unit to rotate. So this gear here acts on this gear here, and it causes it to rotate. And as it's rotating, when it rotates, it causes the starter clutch driven gear, which is this large gear here, you watch that, you will see that it is moving. Okay? And the starter clutch driven gear is on the end of the crankshaft. And also on the end of the crankshaft is the connecting rod, which connects to the piston, which will usually sit inside the cylinder, which I've obviously removed in this case, so you can see a little bit easier. But essentially the starter motor acts on the starter clutch driven gear, which drives the starter clutch, and the starter clutch acts on the crankshaft and causes it to rotate. And that causes the pistons to start going up and down in the engine. So we're starting to get compression, and it also causes the pickup coils to fire, or to signal to fire the spark plug at the correct time, and therefore we get our engine started. So the next thing I want to show you, try and understand the starter clutch a little bit better, is I just want to rotate, I want to drive the starter clutch driven gear, okay, using these gears. Now, as I've shown you, when these gears are turning, so these gears are turning clockwise, it causes the starter clutch driven gear to turn anti-clockwise. And as you can see, the rotor, the crankshaft, the piston are all moving with that driven gear and the starter clutch. Now, if I rotate these gears in the opposite direction, so if I rotate this gear here, these little reduction gears, if I drive them in the counterclockwise direction, you will notice that the starter clutch driven gear is turning clockwise now, so it's turning in the opposite direction, but all of a sudden the crankshaft, the piston and the rotor on the end of the crankshaft are going nowhere. So they are not rotating with it. Okay? So let's do that again. There we can see we got movement because I'm turning the reduction gears clockwise. If I turn them the opposite direction, counterclockwise, the reduction gears, we get no motion on that crankshaft. And this is a key feature of the starter clutch. So the starter clutch is just this unit here. Just this unit here. Hopefully you can see that quite clearly. But it's just this unit here, and it sits between the driven gear and the rotor. Now, as you can see, it's just a tin unit. And the starter clutch is actually connected to the rotor permanently via 3 bolts. So 1, 2 and 3. So when the crankshaft is turning, it brings the rotor with it, and it also brings the starter clutch as well, because the starter clutch is permanently connected to the rotor. So as long as that crankshaft, which is the shaft that runs through the middle of the engine, is rotating, it's bringing that starter clutch with it. And again, what you're noticing there is during normal operation, the driven gear is not rotating. So when the engine is running normally on its own steam, the driven gear is not catching with the starter clutch or with the crankshaft, and it is just staying where it is. But what's happening is the starter clutch contains a number of what we call rollers. So these rollers, they sit in a little space, okay? So it's just going to be a little space, maybe it might not even be the length of my finger, okay? And a little bit like my finger, this space that they sit in is going to be thinner at this end. It's going to be thinner at one end and wider at the other end. And when the rollers are at the wide end, they don't cause the starter clutch to catch with the starter or with the driven gear. Now when the rollers move to the thinner end, where the space is thinner, or where there's less space, they actually get caught between the starter clutch, and they actually jam between the starter clutch and the driven gear, and they cause the starter clutch to move with the driven gear. Okay? So as we can see here, the rollers have actually moved to the thin end, and they're causing, through friction, they're causing the starter clutch to move with the driven gear. Okay? So when we're starting the engine, the rollers are jammed between the driven gear and the starter clutch unit, and they cause the starter clutch, which is connected to the bolted to the crankshaft through the rotor, they cause the whole crankshaft to rotate with the driven gear. Now, this is when the engine is getting started. When the actual engine starts, what happens is that the crankshaft actually begins to move faster than the driven gear. So the driven gear, let's say for example, is rotating at 1000 RPM, so 1000 revolutions per minute. And it's through the rollers that are catching and causing to bring the crankshaft with it. Now when the engine actually gets started through this process, the engine obviously gets started after 1 or 2 seconds, the crankshaft begins to rotate faster than 1000 revolutions a minute. So it might start to rotate at 1500 or 2000 revolutions per minute initially. So all of a sudden the crankshaft is rotating faster than the driven gear. Okay, so if we just imagine the driven gear is driving the crankshaft, and all of a sudden the crankshaft begins to rotate just that little bit faster than the driven gear. What happens is that it causes the rollers in the starter clutch to move to the wide end of the spacing in which they live, and all of a sudden they can't catch the crankshaft, or they can't catch the crankshaft essentially, and they can't act on the crankshaft anymore. So all of a sudden the crankshaft begins to rotate faster than the driven gear. Our engine is running and we release the starter button, and that means that the driven gear stops rotating. And even though the driven gear stops rotating, our engine is running already. And because the rollers are now running freely, or rolling freely, they're not catching the driven gear, and they're not catching between the driven gear and the starter clutch, and the whole thing rotates freely. Now we can take off these bolts here, and we'll be able to see the rollers that are in the starter clutch. So I've already loosened these bolts, so let me just undo them here. So with those 3 bolts off, we can now actually see, if we look in through the little bolt holes, we can actually see the rollers. So let me just do a close-up here. So I think you can see it fairly well here. You can actually see the rollers inside here. So inside these holes you can see the little rollers. So they sit in this little space. And if we just move now obviously I have disconnected the rollers, or sorry, disconnected the starter clutch. It should be, the bolts should be sitting in there, connecting up the starter clutch to the rotor. But when they're removed, the starter clutch is no longer moving with the rotor, or the rotor is no longer moving with the starter clutch. But we can see the rollers again. You can see a little roller in there, a little roller in there. And if I actually, you can see the space that the rollers sit in. And again, when the driven gear is moving counterclockwise, those rollers, as you can see, they're jamming in the tight end. So the tight end is here. They're jamming in the tight end of that spacing, and they're bringing the starter clutches moving with the driven gear. Now let me bring it around so I can see the rollers again. So now if I go bring the starter clutch, if I bring the driven gear clockwise in the opposite direction, you can see that the rollers, I can still see the rollers because the starter clutch is not moving. And the starter clutch is not moving because those little rollers are not catching between the starter clutch with the driven gear. And that's essentially how the starter clutch works. So next up, I want to remove the rotor so that we can take a look at the starter clutch which sits on the other side of it. So what I've had to do is I've had to loosen this bolt which secures on the rotor to the crankshaft. So I've actually had to use this large breaker bar because this bolt is torqued on very tightly, and it also had tread sealant as well to keep it in place. So I've broken it up, or broken it loose with the breaker bar already, so I can just use my electric okay, I'll just remove the bolt. So that's the bolt. I think it's about 10 millimeters in width, this particular bolt. And inside the rotor there is more treads. Okay, so hopefully you can see, you might not be able to see it that easily, but there's treads, inner treads in the rotor. Now this bolt screws in. There's no treads at the end of it, as you can see. They're only at the start of the bolt, and those treads, they tread into inside here. So this bolt is thinner than the inner treads, which are about 14 millimeter. So what I need is this specialist tool, which is called a rotor puller. So this is a universal rotor puller. It's essentially just bolts of different, bolts or screws of different widths. So I've actually had to use the 14 millimeter, which I think was this one. And what you do is you screw it in, and the end of this rotor puller, it essentially pushes on the end of the crankshaft, and as you screw it in, it actually pulls the rotor off the end of the crankshaft. Okay, so I've already loosened this as well. This is going to be torqued on very tightly as well, so I had to use a breaker bar to leverage this as well. So I've already loosened it, so off comes my rotor. So there's the rotor. There you can see on the other side where the rotor puller screws in. So it just essentially just screws in, and then that end there, it just pushes the rotor off the end of the crankshaft. So with the rotor off, now we can see the starter clutch which sits behind it. Now what we need to note here is that on the end of the crankshaft there is a little key which slots in here. Hopefully you can see that easy enough. I'll just dip it down. There's a little key here, so it slots into the end of the crankshaft, and it actually protrudes. So the crankshaft is not smooth the whole way around. This little key is protruding upwards, and that little key has two functions. When you put the rotor back on, so when it goes back onto the crankshaft, there is a little slot here on the rotor, and that has to slot in over that key. Okay, and that ensures that when you're putting your engine back together, the markings on the rotor for the timing of the engine are all in line with the crankshaft and the position of the piston. And then the key also serves to essentially, it locks the rotor with the crankshaft. So if the crankshaft spins, then the rotor spins, and if the rotor spins, then the crankshaft spins. And as the rotor is bolted on to the starter clutch, if the starter clutch is rotating, then so too does the rotor. So let's turn our attention to the starter clutch, which again sits behind the rotor, and we can see now the three rollers which provide the friction, which causes the starter clutch to catch with the driven gear, the starter clutch driven gear, which is driven by the starter motor. And you can see that that friction between the starter clutch and the driven gear is caused by this particular roller moving to the left. Okay, now let me just show it to you here. Let's keep an eye on this roller. As we're starting the engine, this roller has moved to the left. It is creating the friction and it's causing the starter clutch to rotate with the driven gear. So let's just watch this. Let's just go back here again. Let's just watch this roller. Again, the starter motor is driving it up until here. Engine starts, and next thing this starts to move faster. So as you can see, looking at that roller, you can see that it moves back to the right. And when it moves back to the right, it's not creating friction between the starter clutch and the driven gear. Okay, and as a result, it is able to rotate. The starter clutch will be rotating with the rotor and the crankshaft. And it's not bringing the driven gear with it. So the starter has stopped because we've stopped supplying power to it. The engine is running and it runs independently. So that's how the starter clutch works. We can actually pull the starter clutch off to the end of the crankshaft. Before we do that, let's just take a look. Let me see in this one here. You can see here that behind the roller in the housing, there's like a little piece of metal. And this is actually a spring. So this is spring mounted, and I can demonstrate that because if I move that roller, sorry, let me just do it down here. Let me just find a roller that's actually freer. But they're all creating friction here. So let's just roll them out. Okay, so if I move this roller, if I move it, you can see it's been pushed back by the spring. Okay. Let's just do this one here. That's actually down here. Okay, down here it's a little bit freer. So you can see there, once I move that roller over to the left hand side, the spring is pushing it back. So those are the springs that sit behind each of the rollers. So let's pull off this starter clutch. Okay, so you can see here, the springs, I can keep that in place. So that's our starter clutch. And these are the little spring mounts. So there's springs inside, I suppose, inside of that housing. I don't need to open up for the moment. And again, this is the driven gear, which is essentially connected to the starter motor. So that's it. That's how a starter clutch works. Hopefully that clarifies it. If you like this video, then don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll have more videos coming soon. See you later, everyone.